All right, so welcome back to the second edition or the second day of games. So just to quickly recap, yesterday we talked about game trees, which was the sort of a construct that helped us describe what the various states of a game are. And it also helped us appreciate who has a shot at winning the game. So in particular, if you are at a leaf node, then because of our agreement that when a player does not have any moves left, at that point, they lose the game. The leaves are places where the current player is losing. And in general, if you are stranded somewhere in the middle of the tree, then you look at your children, and if you have a child which is such that it's losing for the current player at that child, then that means that your current position is actually winning because you can move to this place, which is going to throw a losing position to your opponent. So you can actually make this move and force your opponent to lose. So therefore, the current position is going to be winning for you. On the other hand, if all your children are winning positions for the current player, then no matter what move you make, you are putting your opponent in a situation where they are actually going to be winning. So there is no way that there's no way that you can win from your current situation if this is the tree that you're faced with. Apparently there is an audio glitch, so let me see if I can do something about that. Just give me a moment. Okay, so my microphone is correctly set. It's possible that it's the ambient noise from the PC, so let me try to turn that off. Okay, so the room certainly feels quieter. Do you think this is any better? Okay, so then I'm not sure if it's sort of an internet thing. Let me just try to move closer to the phone. Okay, what about now? Okay, all right. So I will try to stick to this position, being a little bit close to the microphone. Okay, fantastic. So yeah, thanks for helping me fix that. So let's get back to the game tree. So what we saw yesterday was that the game tree helps us appreciate which player has a winning position versus which player has a losing position. So the way this works is that if the current player has a win, then it's just that the way the game is set up, the other player has no hope of winning unless the current player happens to throw away the game. But we're going to assume throughout that everybody plays rationally, selfishly, and intelligently, which is to say that everybody plays in their best interest and they always know what the optimal moves are. So it's perfect information and no weird strategies, just the optimal ones. Okay, so so that's where we stopped yesterday, and we were looking specifically at the game of subtraction to help us sort of navigate some of these definitions. And from the course notes, you can actually go and play around with variants of subtraction, where you're not just subtracting 1, 2, or 3 tokens, but some different combinations of tokens, and see how the game tree evolves. So there will be a link to the course notes in the description. So feel free to go check that out. There's also a simulation that allows you to generate these game trees for small numbers because, well, the numbers are small because the game tree quickly grows unwieldy and quite large and doesn't even fit on a page. So, but you can try it out for, say, things like 7, 8, 9, 10 tokens even. So feel free to go and experiment with that. And today we're going to start with a new game to introduce a slightly different concept, which is the notion of combining games. In particular, we will use this notation, which makes it looks like we are adding games. But in some sense, what we are actually doing is taking some sort of a disjoint union. So this will become clearer as we go over it with an example at hand. So today's example is going to be this game that we will call Kyle's. So this was a game that goes back to the early 1900s, so over a century ago, and it's apparently derived from a lawn game called Skittles, which I have personally no experience with. But if you've been to bowling events, then maybe this is familiar to you. So what we have in terms of the setup or the game instance is that we have a sequence of bowling pins, which I'm going to abstractly denote by asterisks. I think in the book, it's nice that they've figured out how to actually draw little bowling pins. So you can actually, it's a little more visual. And in fact, I'm not sure if I should experiment with possibly finding an emoji that does it. So let me see if, Okay, there is an emoji. However, the problem with the emoji is that it has multiple bowling pins and the ball as well. So that's going to be confusing. So maybe you can see a tiny emoji on my screen, but I'm going to get rid of it. And so we're just going to live with the stars as being abstract representations of a sequence of bowling pins. Now, what happens when you typically hit the pins with the ball is that some of them topple over and disappear. And the way Kyle's is set up is that in one move, you can either get rid of one of them, or you can get rid of, or you can choose to get rid of two consecutive bowling pins. So one of these things can happen. So I think, let me just write that out because this is kind of the key rule of the game. So basically, you are going to bowl a ball towards this row of bowling pins. In general, so right now all the pins are next to each other. In general, there could be gaps that are created by the pins getting knocked over. But let me just put down what the ball can do. So the ball that's directed at these pins can either knock over a single pin, or it can knock over two adjacent pins. But unlike in real life bowling, nothing else can happen. So of course, if you were doing this in real life, if you were very good, you could probably knock over all the pins in one go. But that is something that's not going to happen here unless those are the only two pins left. Okay, so these are the only two scenarios that can arise, and they also don't happen simultaneously. You have to, in some sense, you have to choose. Okay, so let's maybe work through an example of how the game might play out. So I'm going to actually follow the example in the book. Let me just check if, all right, so I don't think I have questions in the chat so far, so I'm going to assume that we are good. So we have, let's see, 7 bowling pins. These are all lined up with no gaps at the moment, so they're all next to each other, okay? And in the first move, what happens is that the second and the third pins get knocked over. So what you're left with is this, and then you have this gap, and then you have a set of 4 bowling pins. And then the second roll of the ball takes out the fifth pin. So that's what happens in the second round. So player 1 takes out the second and the third pins. The second player takes out the fifth one in the original configuration. So now we are left with a pin, a gap, a gap, a pin, a gap, and then 2 pins. Right. So that's the current state of the game. So
So notice that in some sense we are, well, these gaps are kind of starting to look a little bit awkward, but you can think of, you probably guessed that you can think of each of these as miniature versions of the original game. And in some sense, as a player, you have to pick one of these games to play, right? In remember that you don't get to knock out these two pins simultaneously. So these are not actioned because you have those gaps that go between them, right? So in some sense, the idea is that you pick a mini game to play and then you play inside it. And once you've made your move, you potentially generate even more mini games to proceed with, right? So this is the rules of the game are such that it sort of naturally brings in this idea of the union of two games. Okay, so this in the book is denoted using the plus operator. So you could have G and H. So if we said that the original game setup is that you have a sequence of n pins, after you've knocked over a couple of them, then, well, you have sort of decomposed the game into these two smaller games. The first one starts off with one pin on here. So that's what we mean by the disjunctive union of two games. What's going to happen here is that the player has to pick one of the two games to play in and then sort of proceed from there. And now you're going to, well, so what's going to happen is either you pick, so let me call this G and H. So one of two things can happen. Either you pick G and transform it into, say, J, or you pick H and transform it into, let's say, F. These letters are probably looking fairly arbitrary to you, but I'm just following the notation in the book, and that's kind of what prompts these particular choices. Okay, so if you happen to, so let's say scenario 1 is that you choose to play in G, and you transform G into J, then G plus H transforms into J plus H. The other scenario could be that you could start with H, and then you transform the game G plus H into G plus F, assuming that H morphed into F after your move was made, right? So that's what's going on here. And you can also now sort of let your imagination run a little bit wild and say, well, do I even have to necessarily combine games that are the same? So the answer is no. It's totally up to you how you want to combine. I mean, you could define a game that's the union of two crazy games, and indeed F and J are themselves going to be sums. So for instance, if you were playing in G, the only option for J is going to be sort of a terminal game, because your only option is to roll over the only pin that's there. But on the other hand, if you're playing in H, then you could knock over the middle two pins. That creates F itself is the disjunctive union of two smaller games. On the other hand, if you cut one of the corners, so if you knock over one pin or two pins from the left or the right, then you'll be left with an atomic game. So so indeed, as the game progresses, your sums probably become longer and longer, and then they don't necessarily become strictly longer, but they can. So that would be right. So in fact, if you work through the game tree, which I won't do here in the interest of time, but you will see that it evolves in a fashion that you would expect. But maybe let me just draw out a smaller game tree just to demonstrate how you might combine two different games. So the only other game we have seen so far is the game of subtraction. So let's see if we can talk about a game sum where one of the elements of the sum is an instance of subtraction and the other element is an instance of Kyle's. So we have subtraction plus Kyle's. So again, I hope it'll be clear what we mean to do in a minute, perhaps. So let's say that our initial position is 2 in subtraction, and let's say with Kyle's we have again 2 pins. So this is going to be a short tree. What does this mean? This means that as a player, your first move now is, well, you have a move, but that move consists of A, picking a game to play in, and then B, making a move in the game that you choose to play, and then that has to be a valid move for that game. So for example, from 2 in subtraction plus 2 in Kyle's, you could choose to play the game of subtraction. And in the game of subtraction, now you have 2 possible moves. One is to reduce 2 to 1, and the other is to reduce 2 to 0. So let's say we reduce 2 to 1. Notice that the other component stays exactly the same because you didn't really get to mess around with that. So we're just going to bring that over. On the other hand, you could also choose to play subtraction, but actually take 2 tokens away at a time, and that would give you 0 plus 2. You could similarly do, so you're going to get these 4 states. You could similarly do, choose to play the Kyle's game and knock over 1 or 2 pins in your move. So let me maybe make some space for myself here. All right, so you're going to have 0 here, 2 here, and 2 here. And that's going to be, okay, that's not quite accurate, so I'm going to fix that up in a moment. So here, this is going to be empty. Here, I'm not sure if we really want to make a distinction between which side the gap is on. It's going to lead to the same outcomes eventually. So for now, to save space, I'm not going to write them all out. So you could choose to knock off the pin on the left or the pin on the right. In terms of just a game state, that's you're moving to a state which has just 1 bowling pin. It's not really relevant to the game outcomes as to whether that was a pin with a gap to the left or a gap to the right. So that information is not relevant at all. So we can throw it away and just think of it as this instance. And this, of course, is some sort of an empty instance here. So that's the first layer of the game tree. And you can develop this further by just drilling down again and thinking about at each stage, which game do you want to pick? Of course, the game that you pick has to be in some sort of a non-terminal state. Otherwise, you can't play it further. So that wouldn't work. So for instance, if you are here, then you have to choose to play in Kyle's because the game of subtraction is over, right? So, but other than that, in general, you just develop this game tree same as before. And once again, at every terminal position, it's a current player win. At every terminal position, it's an other player win because the current player has no moves left. Yes. So, and then you build up the winning conditions, same as we did yesterday. So you look at the terminal positions, you mark them red because the current player has lost, and then you work your way up the tree and apply the same rule as before, which is to say that if you have at least 1 current player loss, then you can navigate there. So the current position is a current player win. And if that's not the case, then the current position would be a current player loss. Okay. So, right. So I guess you could think of how the current position wins and losses actually work out in terms of game sums as well. And so I'm going to leave the expansion of the game tree as something to be done offline. I'll do it offline myself before I put up the slides. And now let's just think about, how we can interpret who wins in terms of game sums. So although as I just said, you can build up the tree in pretty much the same spirit as before, let's think about it in terms of the G plus H notation that we just introduced. So what if we are combining a current player loss or an other player win, so that's another player win, with a current player win? Can we say something about this outcome? So without digging, without having any other information about where we are in the game tree necessarily, what we are doing is we are adding a current player win position to an other player win position. So what do you think this looks like? And similarly, let me also ask, do we want to say that it depends on something else, or can we say that this outcome is always, so this outcome is always a certain way? Okay, so perhaps if I had planned this a little bit better, I would have actually drawn out the whole game tree so that you would have some inspiration to look at in terms of patterns. But for now, perhaps we can just try to think of it in terms of general logic. So let me just say, while we are thinking about this, that one of the reasons we want to understand this kind of behavior is that sometimes it's actually an interesting strategy to understand a particular game position is to see if we can somehow decompose it into two smaller games, which are easier to understand. And if that understanding can be directly transferred to the current position, then that gives us an efficient way of evaluating what the positions look like. So for example, if we could say something like, as long as there is, in these components, as long as there is another player win, then the current position is current player wins. If you can make a statement like that, then you can just stare at your sum. And as long as you have information about all the individual pieces, you can in some sense figure out what your current situation is going to be like. So, so let's also maybe think about this case in case it's an easier one to grapple with. What if both the component games are lossy for the current player, meaning that no matter where you play, you're headed for a loss? Is it possible? Is it possible to win this game? Okay, sorry, there are comments in the chat. Right. So okay. So one of the suggestions is that for the first one, the current player wins, and here the current player loses. So I think the response to the prompt was that indeed no, the current player has no hope of winning here. And at least the intuition for this is that imagine that the current player did have a winning strategy. In that case, they would have to if you trace what the strategy does on the game tree, then you can sort of project it on at least one of the games, because ultimately when you stop, it must be that you were able to win one of the smaller games, right? And here, what the other player is going to do is basically just apply their winning strategies, no matter which game they're in. So as the current player, let's say you decide to dig into G, notice that the other player, because this is a current player loss, this means that the other player has a winning strategy. So the other player follows their winning strategy in G and makes that move. And then after the game has been transformed, the original player can either choose to dig further in this direction, or they can start to play in H. Either way, the other player will have a winning strategy at hand that they're going to continue to employ, no matter which world you're playing in, right? So as a result, no matter what the current player does, the other player will be able to force a win. So hopefully that's reasonably intuitive. So if you're adding up two of the other player win positions, so this is what they call in the book. Remember, they call this P for the previous player. So what this works to is that a P plus P is equal to P. Okay. And here the claim was that we're looking at a P plus N, and the claim was that this adds up to N, which is to say that we want to say that the overall game here is actually a win for the current player. So I'm trying to figure out a nice way to denote that. The overall game is a current player win. Whereas here, the overall game is a other player win. For the current player win, again, the broad intuition is to say that the current player can always afford to play G all the way. And in some sense, when you hit the terminal node in G, that's when you're apparently stuck. Well, you're stuck at least in the world of G, but at this point, you actually also have H, so you can choose to start playing an H. And at that point, you start employing your winning strategy. So that will take you to a win. So I hope that that makes sense. So this was sort of one of the, I think, key takeaways from here. Just like yesterday, the main takeaway was how do you combine game states from your children to derive the game state to determine who is winning the current node. Today, one of the main key takeaways is going to be how do you combine your knowledge about the individual the individual components of a game sum. How can you use that to actually Having said that, hopefully these two scenarios are clear. Having said that, note that if both of them are winning for the current player, then it's a little more interesting. It's not obvious what happens, right? In these two cases, I think it was that we had enough intuition to drive home the idea that if the current player is winning as long as you have a win in one, you're good to go. But if you have, all right, so let me just write out the situation that is in fact unclear. So we have G plus H. And this is really the only remaining case for a sum of two games. I'd encourage you to think about, so I think that was the question in the chat. What can you say about, okay, sorry. The question was P plus P. That's the case that we handled just before. I think what we're looking at now is N plus N. So remember, N is like the current player, right? So indeed, N plus N was perhaps the question. So N plus N, it turns out, you may have realized after thinking about this for a few moments that perhaps it's not obvious. So we could try and say the same thing that we said before, that we could try and, I mean, this looks like it should be a strong position for the current player. They, after all, have winning strategies in both of the sub-games. And you would imagine that, well, you choose to play one and you play your strongest game and you win it. You go till the end, and then you start with the other game, except that when you have won, you don't get to trigger the start, right? So it's the other player who starts off in the other position. And they're, of course, forced to start the other game because of the situation you're in. And then you should be able to employ your winning strategy in the other game. So, but it turns out it turns out that unfortunately you can come up with examples of games, and let me see if I can draw it out. So n plus n basically could go either way. And I'm just wondering if, it depends on the number of moves that can be forced is the comment that we have in the chat. I suppose you could bill it to that. So here are the examples that we have in the text. We have okay, I don't think I drew that out right. So here again, these are sort of generic game trees, which we know, for instance, so here this is going to be, this is going to be P. This, remember, P was the other player winning, and N is the current player win. Okay, so these are a couple of examples that we can stare at to see that if you have n plus n, how is this going to play out here in the first one? Well, the current player can choose to play one of these games, and they're going to get sort of terminated immediately on the left. And then the other player chooses to pick up the other game, and they're going to turn the tables and leave it to the original first player to actually lose. Does that make sense? So as the first player, so this is my G and this is my H. So the first player starts in G, makes their move, hits the leaf. The other player, G, is now a dead game. There's nothing to be done. So they move to H, but now they get to call these shots in H. And so they start the game in H. And at this point, they immediately win because they make that one move that takes you to the leaf and hands it back to the current player, the player who started the combined game. So in this case, at that point, H is dead as well. So this is a current player loss, or let me, I think just for consistency, write it down as an other player win. But remember here, you're starting off with two game trees that played individually would have worked out. So you could think of this as subtraction with one token on the table. But now you have two independent games of subtraction with one unit on the table. So the first player cannot sweep off both of the tokens. They have to do it one at a time. So this is why it's problematic for the first player. But on the other hand, and again, in the interest of time, I'm going to leave this as an exercise, but you can verify for yourself that for the second combination of game trees that we have here, this will turn out to be a current player win. And you can think about why that is. I think it does have, as is mentioned in the chat, something about like just the way the number of moves work out. So as a result, mnemonically, it turns out that the n states in the context of game sums are thought of as fuzzy. Remember, these are, again, the current player wins, whereas the p states are actually interpreted as zeros in these sums. And the reason for that may be clear from the behavior that we have already seen, which is to say that when you add a p to an n, you get an n. When you add two p's among themselves, you still get a p. So that behavior might remind you of how zeros work in regular arithmetic, and that's why they're nicknamed zeros in some sense. So that's kind of the high-level sort of summary of game sums. The next thing I did want to talk about, but I think we're a bit short on time today, but I'll leave it as just like fun exercise. If you have two universes that look exactly the same, so in some sense you're looking at, let's say, some sort of a G plus G sort of a situation, then can you say something about who's going to win? And in fact, you can say something about who is going to win even without thinking about what the individual outcomes are. And may just leave you with a hint for how to approach this. Okay, so the answer is that it's another player win. And indeed, you can just wait for the first player to make their move in either universe, and you can end up pretty much mimicking it in the universe that is untouched, right? And notice that the first player never has the last word if the other player pushes this strategy. Okay, so apparently we have enough inspiration from the previous example to derive this strategy. And yes, so this is kind of the idea. You can probably generalize from what you've already seen. So you have copies of the same game, and all you have to do is wait for if you are the second player, you wait for the first player to make them move. Just make sure you observe what move they're making and mimic it in the game that they did not touch. And so it doesn't matter which one they touched. There's one that they haven't touched. And because you just maintain this invariant that you're making sure that the game states remain exactly the same as you go along. This is a strategy that you can always successfully execute as a second player. So games of this sort are always going to be other player wins. And this often allows you to simplify game trees vastly, because you can just, whenever you end up with two copies of the same game, you know that it's another player win immediately. So that's a cool hack. Okay, so that actually brings us to the end of everything I wanted to say today. Tomorrow, we will look at combining instances of subtraction, many instances of subtraction at the same time, which will bring us to this classic game called NIM. And NIM inspires a notion called numbers, which are a lot like numbers, but still different. And I expect that to be a lot of fun. So hopefully see you back tomorrow. We will stop here.